Ladies, gentlemen, and rogues of all ages, one of the most interesting new builds that caught on last season, and pretty much inarguably the best rogue build that was around last season, was Heartseeker Basic Skill Spam Rogue. And this is just an awesome concept. I love basic skill focused builds for any class really, so I was disappointed that going into Season 5, the victimized key passive that made this work so well last season is simply just completely bugged and not working with any of our multipliers for damage at the moment, which makes it far, far weaker than it used to be. Or at least it makes that key passive much weaker. It doesn't necessarily have to affect Heartseeker if we just move around what we use. So what if we took the concept that made that build really fun and strong last season, reworked it around Season 5 concepts, and updated for the Season 5 changes? Well, before the season, due to the bug, most people expected this build to be a bit mid at best. And I'm here to tell you the great news that it is not. It is actually fantastic. I would put it right around the same tier as Rapid Fire, which is just under the very tip of rogue builds. Sort of S tier, just under the S plus that Endariel's Barrage pretty much has by itself. Because while it takes a good 3 or 4 minutes on a boss unless you have absolutely perfect gear, this build can absolutely topple a tier 8 infernal hordes with decent aether gain as well, because the wave clear of the build is fantastic. Not to mention being immortal to anything aside from random desecrator one-shots even on tier 8, and then of course tier 7 is brainless farm mode level of no difficulty and low enough health from enemies that most things get one-shot by our setup, and of course tier 7 hordes is by far the most meaningful, efficient barrier for actual game progression, as that's where you start to get piles and piles of Neath Iron, and it doesn't really get better in tier 8. All that said, this build and this version of it that I've made are way stronger than anyone predicted going into Season 5, and for the most part it comes from a multi-pronged synergy. Shard of Verathiel, the new sword unique, makes basic skills do more damage at the cost of, well, having an energy cost. This lets us trigger the Second Wind passive for massive frequent barrier generation even on a basic skill build, which is great, but it also lets us trigger the mythic unique Ring of Starless Skies. You don't need this mythic unique to make this build function, but it makes it significantly stronger. Verathiel making Heartseeker cost energy makes it gain stacks for Starless Skies, which makes it increase our damage a significant amount. However, it also lowers our resource cost, which does mess with our goals of using the Second Wind passive, right? Well, we can make up with that either by just reaching insanely high attack speed breakpoints, which allow us to attack up to 6 times per second at maximum with this skill, which even with 50% reduced 25 cost is still enough to spend 100 energy every 1.25 seconds of active combat, which is more than frequently enough with the rest of the defense that we have within our setup. But until you reach those crazy attack speed breakpoints, there are ways to affect this too that we will go over as well. All this to say, this is a very synergy heavy build with multiple different types of breakpoints to help bring Heartseeker, one of the more fun rogue builds from last season, back into being one of the best ones this season as well. So we'll start with the skill tree and why we choose what we do, then we'll look at our specialization, then we'll go into the uniques that we use, our legendaries, our affixes, and tempering for the gear itself, and then we'll talk about our Paragon board setup, followed by just how to actually play the build within the game itself. With that said, starting off, you want full ranks of Heartseeker, as it's just our main source of damage within this build. I have like a billion extra ranks, sure, and this is from multiple different gear pieces, all being put together to make this skill have a ton of ranks, because put simply, extra ranks to this are the most important affix that you can get on anything for this build to make it do more damage. So aim for these as much as possible. We take Enhanced Heartseeker as well, which makes it gain attack speed after use, which is just great too, as well as Primary Heartseeker, which gives it a guaranteed ricochet for 75% of the damage of the original shot. Normally this wouldn't be good for single target damage, but we combine this with the Umbracrux unique and the Shade Totem that this summoned so that the ricochets actually increase our single target damage as well, as long as the enemy is standing in the totem's radius. Then we take purely passives within the core cluster here, 3 ranks of Sturdy for bonus damage reduction from close enemies, as well as 3 ranks of Siphoning Strikes for a bit of healing with lucky hit chance on critical strikes. Most of our survivability will come from the barrier that we'll be getting later in the skill tree, but every little once in a while a little bit of damage can get through that barrier, and this just gets completely repaired very quickly from this passive. Then we're going to be moving to the agility cluster, and here we're going to be grabbing Dash as our ability and Cutthroat skill, as well as Enhanced Dash and Methodical Dash with that too. This gives us not only a movement skill, but an effective way of spreading Shadow Imbuement debuff, and also applying the debuff that spreads basic skill damage from Pain Gorger's Gauntlets, on top of also being a Cutthroat skill and agility skill to trigger 2 of our Paragon bonuses, and also importantly our key passive. We're then also going to be grabbing 3 ranks of the Unstable Elixirs passive for a bunch of bonus damage after you drink a potion for a few seconds afterwards, as well as a stun on any nearby enemies when you do this. This is a fantastic one to hunt for extra ranks of on your amulet as well, as you can have this active pretty much constantly in most situations that matter. Then also 3 ranks of the Trick Attack attacks passive. This gives you a stacking buff when applying daze or stun to increase both your crit chance and crit damage, and it is just fantastic value for what it is. Then we're going to be moving on to our actual subterfuge cluster, and here we grab 5 ranks of Dark Shroud just because it's an extremely powerful defensive skill that we activate passively through a legendary aspect. So this skill will not be on our active skill bar itself, and that's important to mention. We also are going to be grabbing the enhancement for a chance to not consume a shadow when hit and a movement speed bonus too, as well as countering Dark Shroud for an extra 10% crit chance bonus when we have at least 1 shadow still on us. After that, we're going to be grabbing Smoke Grenade as well as its enhancement and also countering Smoke Grenade. This applies a debuff to enemies as well as daze if they are actually CCable that will increase the damage that they take by 25%. Then you also take countering Smoke Grenade to reduce the cooldown of this skill by 5 seconds if it hits an elite or boss enemy. If you get 1 roll of Smoke Grenade cooldown reduction as a tempering affix on your gear, then this becomes an infinite loop against elites or bosses where the debuff will last for 5 seconds, but the cooldown of the skill will be 5 seconds or less, which lets you keep the actual debuff part of this up permanently. You can also use this on larger packs of enemies to just quickly trigger loads of stacks of Trig Attack at the start of combat. We then also are grabbing Poison Trap 2, as well as its enhancement, and also Subverting Poison Trap for a 15% damage increase to any enemy caught in the radius of the skill, which also knocks down anything that is crowd controllable. This serves multiple purposes, partly the damage increase to enemies inside, which stacks up both on bosses or elites especially that don't move too much, as well as for combinations with your Shade Totem, which counts as being inside of the trap radius as well and sort of double dips on these bonuses. Then we're going to be taking some passives in this cluster too. 1 rank of the Exploit passive for bonus damage to healthy and injured enemies. I do have a bunch of extra ranks from this on my amulet. That's not ideal necessarily, it's just what I happen to have at the time of making this. We're also going to be getting 3 ranks of Malice for bonus damage to vulnerable and knocked down enemies, and we knock down enemies mostly just by using Poison Trap itself. Then we're going to be moving on to our Imbuement cluster over here, and here we're going to be grabbing Shadow Imbuement as a skill and its enhancement, as well as Mixed Shadow Imbuement. We do this specifically to apply to our dash charges to both increase our wave clear ability by spreading Shadow Imbuement around, but also this is great for boosting our single target or priority damage due to increasing the non-physical damage intake of enemies affected by the Shadow Imbuement debuff. And all of our basic skill shots count as cold damage thanks to our setup. We then also are going to be grabbing Cold Imbuement as well as its enhancement and also Mixed Cold Imbuement, though like Dark Shroud, this will not actually be on our bar. It will simply be activated by a legendary aspect, and the main point of putting points into this, even though it's sort of automatic, is to get Mixed Cold Imbuement active, which gives you the massive boost to cold imbued skills against chilled or frozen enemies. Then for the same reason, we're going to be grabbing 3 ranks of the Frigid Finesse passive for another massive bonus to chilled or frozen enemies, and this is the absolute ideal singular passive to get extra ranks for on your amulet if you can choose. Otherwise, the second best is Unstable Elixirs, which we talked about back here, and the third one is going to be Alchemical Advantage, which we'll get to in a moment. But first we need 1 rank of Deadly Venom for bonus poison damage, so let us actually reach 3 ranks of Alchemical Advantage. This gives you a bunch of bonus lucky hit chance and attack speed when dealing poison damage to enemies. We manage this entirely through Poison Trap, which we can apply frequently enough to activate the buffs, and this passive is importantly attack speed that applies over the initial cap. It is bracket to attack speed. The simple way of saying it is imagine if we hit 100% attack speed through our gear, our elixir, and one of our legendary aspects. This passive will go above and beyond that cap by being in a separate attack speed bracket, and attack speed is a really big part of how to increase the damage of this build setup to the point that I have it in this footage. Then we move on to the Ultimate Node cluster, and here we're going to be taking Death Trap as well as its first enhancement, and this is the lowest cooldown ultimate skill, which is the main reason we take it. It also counts as a trap skill to help activate some bonuses for that. It pulls enemies in with the first enhancement, which is helpful, but mostly this is to trigger both Preparation as our specialization and the No Witnesses Legendary Paragon bonus 2. We grab some passives here as well, 1 rank of Innervation to give us some lucky hit chance to get the actual energy back when we shoot things, and we'll also have a ton of bonus ranks of this from your gear. These skill ranks come from one of our uniques, as well as the Resource Tempering Affix slots, and they are actually quite important in this build as you reach your higher attack speed breakpoints and thresholds to keep up with our energy spending speed that we will have as a result of that. Then we're going to be grabbing 2 ranks of Second Wind. We get 4 ranks of this from a Tempering Affix that has a single Masterworking proc, and 6 ranks of this total is 90% health gained as barrier every time you spend 100 energy. You could fit an extra rank in here to make it 7, but it is simply unnecessary. That would put it above 100% health barrier, and 90% health barrier is absolutely enough in my personal setup to survive anything but random Desecrator one-shots in tier 8 Infernal Hordes, and it even survives those sometimes. And that is honestly the goal that I have with any build this season. If it survives that, then it's tanky enough. That said, with our final skill points, we get our key passive, and with this it's going to be Close Quarters Combat. Victimize as a key passive is broken, unfortunately, right now, and the other thing that you would probably use for this, if it could work, would be Precision, but that doesn't work with basic skills, so it simply doesn't apply here. The only one left of any value is CQC for both the 15% attack speed bonus in both bracket 1 and also 15% for bracket 2, but then also the further damage bonus with both of these active anyways. And then we use Dash to proc the Cutthroat bonus, Heartseeker automatically doing the marksman part itself. Past that then is our Specialization. I mentioned it briefly, but we are using Preparation both to activate the damage reduction part of this as often as possible for survivability purposes, and to also let us activate the No Witnesses Paragon node for a multiplicative boost to all damage for a time window after using an ultimate. This combined with our high energy spending on rapid actual Heartseeker casts lets us trigger the ultimate extremely frequently, which also helps us reset our other cooldowns too. With that covered then, let's talk about our equipment, starting out with our uniques and mythic uniques specifically. No singular mythic unique is required to run this build in the first place, but 3 of them do make a very, very big difference. The Ring of Starless Skies essentially makes this possible to spam with the unique sword, because otherwise the energy cost would just be too high at high attack speeds. But with lower attack speed, you are still fine without this. It just will be a fair bit weaker because 50% bonus damage is very literally 50% bonus damage, and that's why we combo this with the Shard of Verathiel. Not to mention the stats on this ring are pretty solid for this build too. Without this, you would want a copy of my other ring, but with the intercom aspect, because we are very able to stand still for long periods of time, but this is one of the core synergies, honestly, and you do really want to try and focus on this one. Past that, in your chest slot, you want Tyrael's Might ideally if you can. This is just the be-all end-all of survivability for a singular item. Loads of maximum element resist bonus, lots of general element resist too, so you don't have to actually focus that elsewhere, and movement speed and damage reduction as an actual affix that can be boosted with masterworking ranks as well. Ideally, you would have 2 masterworking procs on the max element resist like I do here, but your third would be on damage reduction instead of movement speed. Then the final one is the real cherry on top, and this sort of depends on breakpoints. If you are purely speed farming, then you would actually generally rather have the Crown of Lucian and your helmet, as this re-raises the energy costs after putting them down from Starless Skies. This makes survivability very brainless with this on, because Second Wind will be activating constantly with increased energy costs. That said, it takes a lot of ranks of the Innervation passive to actually keep up the energy gain with this, because you'll be increasing your energy costs as well once you have, proper attack speed to make this a problem. So it's sort of a back and forth situation depending on your other stats. That said, the real true end goal of this slot generally is the Harlequin Crest Mythic Unique, and this provides a ton of defense, just 20% passively. The extra skill ranks are incredible for this build and the way that it functions in general. The cooldown reduction from this is great too, and if you are using this, of course you can drop the armor affix off of our pants so that you don't overcap on armor. When this becomes viable is basically dependent on your attack speed stats. If you can keep your Second Wind barrier at high uptime even with this helmet on and with Starless Skies as well, then your attack speed is fast enough for this to be the best head slot choice. And once that is the case, the survival honestly turns really properly brain off and the damage gets even better too. That said, moving on to your regular uniques, the most important one for our setup and the main synergy that makes this work is the Shard of Verathiel. It is paramount for this. It makes Heartseeker cost resource but gain damage, and this is what lets Heartseeker proc Starlit Skies and increase our damage significantly. It also is what makes it proc Second Wind. This weapon also comes with loads of bonus basic skill ranks on it, which is fantastic, and it has a pretty high basic skill attack speed affix on it too, which is bracket 2 attack speed, which is really good because it applies over the standard cap. Then we also have the Umbracrux Dagger too, and this is partially because it has extra ranks to innervate, which is fantastic for this setup, and partially because the Shade Totem that this spawns is fantastic for pretty much any rogue build right now, with the way that it just multiplies and reflects damage. Then our last unique is going to be the Paingorger's Gauntlet's Gloves, which uses our non-basic skill damage through things like dashes through enemies, shadow imbuement explosions, poison trap or death trap damage, or even smoke grenade damage, and uses that to boost and spread our basic skill damage, making us way better at group clearing, which is why it is just so effective in the infernal hordes. Moving on then, we have our legendary aspects for the build. On your two-handed weapon, you want the Moonrise aspect for 20% bonus bracket 1 attack speed, as well as a ton of bonus basic skill damage when the effect is at full stacks. Then in your amulet, we have the aspect of adaptability. This is a resource aspect that gives you damage to basic skills at high energy, which makes it awesome for an amulet slot within this setup. Then for our ring, we have the cold clip aspect to make every basic skill count as cold imbued, which is why our Heartseeker is always dealing cold damage, and this is also increasing damage done to chilled and frozen enemies, which does apply to staggered bosses as well, which is important to note. On our pants, we have the Umbrous aspect here to passively spawn Dark Shroud shadows when you crit enemies, with lucky hit chance tied into it too. Then on our boots, we have the concussive strikes aspect for a lucky hit chance to daze enemies, as well as bonus 2 damage against daze enemies too, which does of course count for staggered bosses as well. With that said, let's talk about our actual affixes that we aim for, and tempering on top of that too. And on your two-handed weapon, you want dexterity, maximum life, and crit damage. For tempering, you want bonus projectile chance for Heartseeker specifically, as well as damage per Dark Shroud Shadow, as this just stacks up really well as an offensive bonus with 5 shadows active at the same time. For masterworking procs, ideally you would have 1 on the bonus projectiles so that it ends right around 100% at maximum masterworking, then the other 2 both on dexterity for bonus skill damage in general. For your amulet, you want frigid finesse passive ranks, which I don't have here, alchemical advantage bonus ranks, which would be great, unstable elixirs bonus ranks as well, otherwise you want crit chance, attack speed, or lucky hit chance. For tempering, bonus ranks to the innervation passive and damage per Dark Shroud Shadow. On your ring, dexterity, attack speed, and crit damage, and for tempering, again, ranks to innervation and damage per Dark Shroud Shadow would be ideal, though I don't quite have that last one on my own ring here. For pants, you want Heartseeker ranks above all else. Then armor, if you aren't wearing the Harlequin crest, which can be dexterity instead if you are wearing the Harlequin crest. The third affix should be maximum life. For tempering, you want bonus ranks to second wind and lucky hit to stun enemies. Masterworking procs would ideally be 1 on the second wind so that it hits 4 ranks, and both others on Heartseeker ranks for bonus damage. Then finally we have our boots, dexterity, maximum life, and movement speed are the ideal stats, with tempering being smoke grenade cooldown reduction and movement speed per Dark Shroud Shadow. If you don't have Tyrael's Might, you want to make sure to fill in your elemental resistances as needed, and generally I would recommend using the Shroud of Kandurus unique chest piece as a replacement, both because it has extra Dark Shroud ranks which are quite useful, and the pull on evade, which is really nice to have in the setup too, as having enemies grouped up makes your damage much higher. For gems, you want to fill your jewelry with either skulls or otherwise if you need armor resistances. For armor, you want to use rubies for bonus maximum life, and then in your weapons you want to use diamonds for extra ultimate damage, specifically to fuel the No Witnesses Paragon node. Speaking of which, with gear covered, let's dive into our actual Paragon board setup for this build, and on the starting board you would normally just go up the left side if you don't have Tyrael's Might, because you would want the extra all element resist. If you do have Tyrael's Might, however, that's unnecessary, so go up the right side through the damage, rare, and magic nodes, and then grab the glyph socket in the middle here, inside of which we put the ranger glyph, mostly for the damage reduction, but this does also increase their damage with marksmanship skills. If you are speed farming and damage intake is not an issue for you, you can replace this instead with something like the combat glyph to increase your damage with critical strikes, which also would help plug up any energy issues that you might have if you're running the Crown of Lucian variation. Past that, you want to head up the left side of the board through the damage, rare, and magic nodes, as well as of course getting the actual dexterity to activate the glyph. Then we attach on our second board, which is going to be No Witnesses. Here you want to go up and left to get the glyph socket as fast as you can, which is going to be fluidity. This gives you a bonus to all magic nodes within range, as well as the secondary bonus of giving you an increased damage and also energy regeneration for a few seconds after you cast an agility skill. We cast dash relatively frequently, and so we do keep this bonus active specifically from doing that. After that, you want to head up and left to get here to these ultimate and critical damage, rare, and magic nodes. These are quite valuable for us specifically and importantly on this board. Then you want to round back and go through the maximum health, rare, and magic nodes here on your way up to round over to the legendary node itself of the board, which gives us extra damage with ultimate skills, but also makes our ultimate skill apply a portion of this stat to all skills for a few seconds after we use it, up to a set maximum. We grab the bonus ultimate damage that is over here, as well as the attack speed that's there too, just because we can. Then we're going to be heading out of the right side of the board here and detaching on the cheap shot board. You want to start this board by heading up and grabbing the damage to crowd controlled enemies, rare, and magic nodes, then go down through the bottom through the damage reduction from elite, rare, and magic nodes to get around to the legendary node itself for the board, which gives us an increasing stacking buff per nearby crowd controlled enemy, applying its full bonus against staggered bosses. We then are going to be working our way out to the glyph socket itself, and inside of here we are putting the control glyph, which gives us bonus damage to crowd controlled enemies, as well as a multiplicative damage increase to slowed and chilled enemies, which is doubled against stunned or frozen enemies. We grab a bunch of intelligence in the radius and also the devious rare node as well. Then we're going to be heading out the top of the board through the damage to crowd controlled enemies, rare, and magic nodes as well to attach on the deadly ambush board up here. We're going to be heading through the trap cooldown reduction, rare, and magic nodes on the left here to get to the legendary node itself, which gives you a 23% increased critical strike damage multiplier to any enemies that are within the radius of your trap skills, which of course includes poison trap and death trap, and pretty much any major enemy will be standing in these for at least a reasonable amount of time based on the way that you want to play the build. Then you wrap over to the glyph socket itself, and in here we put the ambush glyph. This increases the damage that you deal to enemies within trap skill radius, as well as a secondary effect of doing the same thing, but as a multiplier. We also are going to be grabbing the rare and magic nodes for damage reduction from enemies affected by our traps, as well as the strength to actually activate the glyph itself. Then you want to head back down, and we're going to be attaching to the bottom of the cheap shop board now. Here we're going to be putting the exploit weakness board, and you want to head down and left through the damage reduction from vulnerable enemies, rare and magic nodes, to get to the legendary node itself. This is a stacking buff that you get through lucky hits when hitting a vulnerable enemy, and this increases your damage until you reach maximum stacks. At maximum stacks, it will stay at the full bonus for 6 seconds, and then it will reset. Our attack speed and lucky hit chance is high enough, as well as our vulnerable application chance from using cold imbued skills, that we will actually have this at its maximum bonus much more often than we won't, honestly. Then we'll be attaching our final board to the top of the No Witnesses board up here, and it will be the Tricks of the Trade board. Here we're going to be going up and right to get to the glyph socket itself, inside of which we're going to be putting the Canny glyph. This gives you bonus damage with non-physical effects, and also a secondary effect that applies a debuff to enemies, making them take more damage from non-physical damage effects, multiplicatively the more that they take from this type of damage. Then we'll be moving left and wrapping around, going through the damage to the enemy elites, rare and magic nodes, as well as getting the intelligence to activate the effect, and then we head up to the legendary node itself of the board, which makes your marksman skills grant you extra cutthroat skill damage for 8 seconds afterwards, and vice versa. We of course are going to be activating the extra marksman skill damage by using dash, which is a cutthroat skill, but we also will be doing the opposite because Heartseeker will obviously just be applying the marksman buff constantly to the cutthroat skills. And that pretty much just takes care of our Paragon board then, so let's just talk about how to actually play this build in combat. Your main damage is Heartseeker. As long as you are going to hit an enemy, hold down the Heartseeker button so you attack them. Dash is used to activate our various agility and cutthroat buffs, but try to use it specifically with Shadow Imbuement to spread this debuff to larger packs of enemies and increase our non-physical damage. This combo gets its cooldown reset by the preparation specialization every time that you use Death Trap, so you can do this pretty frequently as new enemies spawn, or if you have to use the skill for movement. Poison Trap you want to use pretty much on cooldown, aiming to stack them under elites or bosses if possible. Smoke Grenade, always throw this at elites or bosses, or just to activate multiple stacks of trick attacks on a larger group of enemies. Death Trap basically you want to use on cooldown, but make sure that you have used your other abilities first so you can take advantage of the reset. Otherwise, just spam Heartseeker to your heart's content. That pretty much does it for today then, everyone, and I'm honestly really happy with how strong this one turned out when it's fully put together. I messed with a bunch of variations of this before finding the one that really felt like it works, and I should mention that you can use something like Caltrops as a skill instead of Shadow Imbuement to up the single target damage, but I find the wave clear to be so much more important in an infernal hordes focused endgame like we have in Season 5. And Shadow Imbuement spread by dash, which also increases enemy damage taken in general from the build, it just feels like an incredibly good combo with this setup. I hope you've all enjoyed this then, and I hope you enjoy using this build too if you try it out for yourself as well. Like if you liked the video, subscribe to the notification bell for more, and most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, until next time, stay sweet. Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.